A meeting in a restaurant almost broke my life. Hello, my name is Sophia. I want to share with you a story that happened to me a couple years ago. It changed me. It's worth starting with the day everything changed. It was a beautiful morning, the kids were off to school without any reminders, and the coffee was perfect. I stood in front of the mirror, fixing my hair and smiling at my reflection. I was 35 years old, successfully building a career as a marketer, confident in my abilities and happy in my family life. Everything seemed absolutely perfect. The evening promised to be special. Our agency had organized a corporate party in a fancy restaurant, and I knew that I would shine there. Colleagues were discussing all day long who would go to the event with whom. Several times, I heard someone mention my name along with the name of Max, a new employee who had recently joined our team. This caused me mild anxiety. Although we hadn't met yet, I knew about his transfer to the company. When I entered the restaurant, my gaze immediately fell on Max. He was standing among his coworkers, and his laughter was so genuine. He was wearing an elegant but modern suit that emphasized his figure. Our gazes crossed, and mixed feelings of uncertainty and attraction surged through me. Smiling at him, I stepped closer. We had a quick conversation and quickly moved from work projects to personal topics. Successes, ambitions, future plans, our conversations became more and more open. I was struck by his enthusiasm and the passion with which he shared his ideas. They seemed to flow in a continuous stream. Max paid me an unexpected compliment, telling me that I had an amazing talent for finding positive solutions to even the most difficult situations. Those simple words had an almost magical effect on me. Though thoughts of my husband Alex staying home with the kids tended to come back to me, this moment seemed especially important. Our gazes met again, and I caught something more in his eyes. But was it fear or temptation? After that evening, I began to have troubling thoughts. What had started out as a casual conversation turned into an intense infatuation that I couldn't resist. Max continued to show signs of attention, his tender glances and casual touches filled my days with unusual emotions. One day we met in a cozy cafe, and our conversations became even more open and trusting. I felt a special bond forming between us. Every time I returned home, I felt remorseful. Alex and I exchanged glances, and even though there were no words between us, I realized that this silence could lead to something irreparable. Alex began to notice a change in me. I was becoming thoughtful and distant from our daily routine. When I met up with Max again, I realized that this conversation wasn't going to be easy. We were sitting in a cafe, drinking coffee and talking about life. Max suddenly leaned toward me and looked into my eyes and whispered that he felt like we had more than just friendship. Those words turned my world upside down. I found it hard to breathe. I knew it was dangerous to take the next step. I thought of my children and husband waiting for me at home. Even so, I couldn't resist my feelings for Max. I froze, our lips finally connected, and time stopped around us. Since then, I'd been caught in a swirl of conflicting feelings, joy and guilt that swept over me every time I ran off on a date with Max. My life began to be wrapped in a web of deceit. I made up stories about being late at work, when in fact I was spending every free moment with him. I couldn't stop thinking about Max. One morning at breakfast, Alex asked me about a project I was working on. His question caught me off guard, my heart racing, and a wave of panic swept over me. Trying to avoid his gaze, I replied that everything was going fine, just a little slow. But the question reminded me of how easily I was destroying my family. Every night after work, I rushed to meet Max, immersing myself in the mad pleasure of those moments, forgetting about my family waiting for me at home. Every hour I spent with him turned into an addiction. I couldn't do without him and was ready to risk everything. I realized that I was entangled in a web of my actions, fear and anguish became unbearable, but I had no strength to go back. No counseling with a psychologist helped, it seemed that I could only continue to play this dangerous role. As the weeks passed, I often stayed at work late into the night. One day, when I returned home from my meeting with Max, I found Alex sitting in a chair with a somber look on his face. His eyes were filled with sadness. My heart beat faster when I saw the look of doubt in his eyes. I tried to excuse myself by saying that I was late with my report, but every word resonated with pain. Alex stared at me in silence, and his doubts became obvious. An uneasy feeling grew inside me. I tried to convince him that I was really working late, but his attentive gaze instantly dispelled all my attempts to hide the truth. The evening passed in heavy silence, leaving me feeling misunderstood and hurt. A few days later at work, preparing for an important presentation, I suddenly felt a growing fear. Suddenly, I received a message from Alex with attached pictures of me with Max at a party. Underneath the pictures was the caption, "Sophia, do you want to explain this to me?" Fear paralyzed me, my thoughts were confused, and I didn't know what to do. A lot of questions were popping up in my head. Where did Alex get these photos? Who could have given them to him? And why? To pull myself together, I went to the restroom to wash my face with cold water. I didn't want to get my face in the mud, because I had an important presentation ahead of me. Back in the conference room, I noticed that some of my colleagues were whispering, but I was too absorbed in my thoughts to think about that too. Gathering my courage, I announced that I was ready to begin my presentation, but my voice was shaking with tension. As I spoke, I caught slanted glances and smirks. At one point, one of my colleagues interrupted my presentation and, holding up his cell phone with those very pictures flashing on the screen, said, "Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?" The room fell silent, and my breath caught. My heart raced, and it felt like the whole world was falling apart. I looked at my hands as if I hoped the truth would remain hidden, but I realized that it had already come out. My coworkers looked at me with confusion and sympathy, and their whispers seemed like a deafening rumble. The meeting ended and I ran out of the hall, knowing that my life now hung in the balance. When I got home, I met Alex. His face was contorted with anger and I saw disappointment in his eyes. He looked at me, and in his gaze, I could see the pain of betrayal. I knew he was waiting for an explanation, but I couldn't say anything because the words wouldn't come out of my throat. I wanted to reassure him, but all my efforts were in vain. His anger and frustration hit me like knives and hurt me more than any blows. Eventually, I backed away, feeling like I would pass out if I stayed standing there any longer. My thoughts were racing haphazardly, and every attempt to pull myself together ended with me losing my balance again. Alex was watching me, but his face said he had no desire to listen to me. Instead of helping me deal with the situation, he left to another room, closing the door so he couldn't hear my voice. I was left alone, sitting on the kitchen floor, listening to the sounds echoing throughout the house. My soul was tearing with pain, but I couldn't find comfort because I knew I deserved this punishment. My guilt was weighing on me heavier than the physical pain, and every minute I wanted to run away from it, but where would I run from my own shadow? I stood up, trying to regain control of my actions, but my legs refused to obey and I felt dizzy. I walked past the mirror, but I didn't recognize myself. The woman looking back at me from there was alien, unfamiliar, strange, a stranger who had lost herself. Gradually I came to my senses, only to realize that I had lost everything. My family was destroyed, my career was destroyed, and most importantly, I myself was lost. A few days passed and no one at work wanted to talk to me. There was an icy silence in the office. At home, Alex remained cold and withdrawn. Every time I tried to speak, he cut me off with a short yes or a no, avoiding even looking in my direction. Unable to bear it, I felt my life slowly but surely falling apart, and I was the cause of it all. One day, when Alex came home from work, I had a long time to gather my courage before I approached him. A storm of emotions was boiling inside me, of fear, guilt, hope that he would hear me and forgive me. I tried to hug him, but he pushed me away and stared up at the ceiling, as if he were searching for answers to the questions that plagued his soul. I wanted to tell him that I didn't want us to break up, that I was confused, but my words sounded pathetic and helpless. I needed to say something, to try to explain. Alex sighed heavily, then looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His voice was full of pain and frustration. I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet, and my heart clenched with fear of what might happen next. In desperation, I tried to convince him that I was remorseful, that I was admitting my mistakes. But he only shook his head, and his gaze grew even colder. He said that everything had already happened, and he wasn't sure if he could ever trust me again. He felt betrayed and broken. He reminded me of my promises, which turned out to be empty words. Those words came down on me like a heavy weight, pressing me to the ground. My legs could barely hold me up, and tears lodged in my throat. But despite all the pain, I knew I had to hold on for the sake of the children. They weren't supposed to notice the crack that had formed in our family. Gathering the last of my strength, I walked out of the room, leaving Alex alone with his thoughts and grief. Sessions with a psychologist became a kind of outlet for me, where I could express my deepest feelings. However, each new session brought more and more questions that I did not have answers to. The psychologist kept persistently asking questions that got right to the heart of the problem, and one day I realized that I could no longer hide the truth. Max had become an important part of my life, and I hadn't expected our relationship to go beyond mere communication. When I realized this, I felt guilty and ashamed, but I knew that further hiding the truth would only make things worse. So I decided to be honest and told the psychologist everything that was going on inside me. This confession was not easy, but I knew it was necessary for my inner healing. However, admitting my mistake raised new doubts. When the psychologist asked if I believed what I was saying, I felt confused. Perhaps I really did not fully realize how serious the consequences of my actions could be. This question made me think and rethink my behavior. At home, things were getting more and more tense. Night after night, I tried to explain to Alex how everything had happened, but every word was difficult. Even though he was still there, I could feel the distance between us growing every day. Our family was falling apart, and the thought of it horrified me. On the verge of hysterics, I quietly repeated to him that I needed time to sort myself out. I realized that rebuilding trust would take time and effort, but I was willing to do whatever it took to save our family. I tried my best to forget the past, but Max continued to write to me persistently. Even though he knew the complexity of my situation, his messages kept coming regularly. Gradually, he became a kind of support for me, someone who listened to my worries and offered support. But one day, when I shared my inner conflicts with him again, his response evoked contradictory emotions in me. He wrote that he was always ready to support me, but he missed my honesty. He suggested that perhaps the situation is not as clear-cut as I make it out to be. These words angered me. The desire to hide the whole truth, to cover up the problem and pretend that nothing was going on, rose up inside me again. Meanwhile, Alex, who had accidentally stumbled upon our correspondence, became furious. The cold tone of his voice betrayed deep resentment and distrust. He asked why I was still in touch with Max, despite all our conversations and attempts to mend our relationship. I tried to explain that I tried to put it behind me, but in those moments when I was struggling with myself, it was Max who was there for me. But I knew that those explanations were unlikely to change his mind. Eventually, Alex and I decided to see a marriage counselor. We started working on rebuilding our relationship, gradually analyzing ourselves and our marriage. Each session reflected our depression, doubts, and unresolved issues. Alex tried to contain his anger, but it was obvious that his emotional wounds were still fresh. There were moments when we wanted to give up and leave, but our desire to be a happy family again gave us the strength not to give up. Talking to a specialist helped us deal with the most difficult situations. We both felt that we had missed out on many happy moments. Inner fears and misunderstandings were exposed with every question. Returning home after each session, we felt the weight of responsibility. One evening Alex confessed that he wasn't sure if he could forgive me. After all he had been through, he didn't know if he could ever see me as his wife again. Every step took a huge effort, but we kept working on ourselves and I could feel our relationship starting to change more and more. I realized that the only way to get Alex back was to drastically change the environment around us. After much deliberation, I finally came to a decision to quit my job. It was a bold move, but I believed it was necessary in order to make a fresh start. While my family life was in danger of falling apart, my new job offered me many opportunities. For the first time in a long time, I felt a wave of enthusiasm when I walked into the new company's office. Seeing the friendly coworkers, I immediately felt like part of the team. One of the coworkers offered me a cup of coffee and greeted me warmly, showing that she was happy to see me. This small act of kindness filled me with gratitude and confidence that I had a bright future ahead of me. As I plunged headlong into my work, I felt truly satisfied. Every morning I got up with a sense of purpose and confidence in who I am. I strived to be the best version of myself, and I soon noticed that these changes didn't go unnoticed. Alex began to notice the changes as well. He saw that my mood had improved and that I was more open and joyful. One evening when we were sitting at the same table again, he noted that I had changed a lot. Gradually we began to rebuild trust in each other. Our hearts opened again to a new beginning. We actively worked on the relationship, discussing important issues and resolving difficulties that arose. Each new day was another step toward rebuilding our union. As time passed, I could feel our bond growing stronger. We learned to understand each other better, to find compromises and appreciate every minute spent together. This new stage in our lives promised to be bright and filled with love.